A man can build a house with his own two hands, frame its walls against the endless plains and shingle its roof against the sun, and still not know the meaning of home. For home is not the latch on the door, but the hand that is welcome to lift it. Not the fire in the hearth, but the warmth of a shared glance across the room. This is the story of such a house, and the quiet man who learned its truth not in the raising of its timbers, but in the careful, tender mending of a trust more fragile than glass. Silas Blackwood measured his life in the straight lines he carved into the land, the neat rows of his small cornfield, the unwavering posts of his fences, the precise stacks of firewood by the door. His homestead was an island of order in the vast, untidy expanse of the prairie, and he was its solitary keeper. Each morning, the sun found him already at work, his movements economical and sure. He ate his meals at a table set for one, the second chair a silent testament to a future he'd long stopped planning for. The house was sturdy, the well was deep, but the silence within its walls was a different kind of depth, a hollow ache that routine could not fill. He would light a single lamp in the evenings, its glow pushing back the immense darkness, but it only served to illuminate the emptiness. The bed was made for one, the nights were long, and loneliness was a fine dust that settled on every surface, no matter how often he cleaned. One sweltering afternoon, returning from town with supplies, he found a letter waiting, tucked into his doorframe. It was not in a script he recognized. The words inside were blunt, transactional. A debt, owed to him by a cousin he hadn't seen in a decade, had been settled. A housekeeper, her passage paid, was arriving on the next stage. Her name was Elara. The letter was a statement of fact, not an offer. Silas read it twice, his jaw tightening. He had not asked for this. He had not asked for his solitude to be disturbed, for his quiet, orderly world to be invaded by a stranger. He crumpled the paper in his fist, the sound loud in the still air. But the debt was real, and his honor was a line as straight and unyielding as his fences. The woman was coming. He smoothed the letter out on the table, the lamplight flickering over the stark words. His quiet house would be quiet no more. The stagecoach ride had rattled the teeth in Elara's head and settled a fine layer of grit over every inch of her skin. The town was little more than a dusty street, squinting in the sun, and the man waiting for her was as stark and unyielding as the landscape. He was tall, broad in the shoulder, his face weathered by work and silence. He did not smile. He simply took her single worn valise, his calloused fingers brushing hers for a brief, impersonal second, and said, "Ma'am, I'm Silas Blackwood." His voice was low and gravelly, a sound that seemed to come from the very earth he stood on. She kept her head tilted, letting her bonnet and a lock of hair shadow the left side of her face. It was a practiced, reflexive gesture, a shield she had carried for years. The ride to his homestead was silent, the creak of the wagon wheels the only conversation. The house was simple, clean, and fiercely masculine in its solitude. He showed her inside, the main room holding a table, 2 chairs, a cold hearth, and a neatness that spoke of profound loneliness. "This will be your room," he said, indicating the only bedroom. It was small, containing a sturdy bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand, and a single window. "I'll take my bedroll to the barn." Her head snapped up. "No, I will not put you out of your own bed. The floor or a corner in here is fine." Her voice was steadier than she felt. Pride was the only currency she had left. He looked at her, his gaze direct but not lingering. He seemed to take in her patched dress, the defensive set of her shoulders, but his eyes did not sweep over her with the invasive curiosity she dreaded. The arrangement was for a housekeeper. A housekeeper requires a room. This is the room. His tone was final, but it was the finality of principle, not command. "The well is there," he gestured. "The kitchen is yours to manage as you see fit. I am in the fields from sunup to sundown. Your time is your own. so long as the work is done. He set her valise down by the bed. For a moment, he seemed about to say more, but he only gave a slight, formal nod. I will leave you to settle. He turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him, leaving her alone in the quiet, shadowed room that was, against all odds, his first offering of respect. The first days passed in a silent, careful rhythm. Silas rose before the dawn, and by the time Elara entered the main room, he was gone. A single clean cup and plate already washed and put away. The house, which had been merely a shelter, began to change. The air, once still and sterile, now carried the scent of baking bread, of dried lavender she'd found and hung from a beam. The silence was different, too. It was no longer an absence, but a presence, the soft scuff of her shoes on the floorboards, the quiet clink of a spoon against a bowl. It was a living silence, and it settled something restless in him. He came in from the fields one evening, his shirt torn at the shoulder where it had snagged on a wire fence. He was reaching for his sewing kit, a clumsy affair of thick thread and a single large needle, when she spoke from the doorway of the kitchen. I can mend that for you, Mr. Blackwood. He stopped. He had not heard her approach. He turned, holding the ripped garment. She stood with a small basket of thread in her hands, her gaze fixed on the tear, not on his face. He watched the way she held herself, always angled slightly away, as if to offer only her right side to the world. He had noticed the scar, of course, a pale, silvered mark that cut from her temple to the curve of her cheek. He'd noticed it the first day, and had made a deliberate choice not to let his eyes rest there again. To stare was a violation. It is simple work, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. I can manage. My stitches will hold better, she replied, her tone even. It was not a plea, but a statement of fact. She was offering her skill, a fair trade for her keep. He hesitated, then slowly extended the shirt to her. Thank you. Her fingers brushed his as she took the fabric. Her hands were deft and sure. She sat in the chair by the window, the fading light catching in her hair as she bent over her work, her needle flashing in and out of the rough cotton. He sat at the table, cleaning oil and dirt from a piece of harness, and watched the quiet, focused grace of her movements. The house was filled with the tiny, rhythmic sound of a needle pulling thread, stitching something more than cloth back together. Elara learned the topography of Silas Blackwood's silence. There was the weary silence of the end of a long day's work, the focused silence of a man repairing a tool, and the watchful silence, the one that made the skin on her arms prickle, not with fear, but with a strange, unnerving awareness. He never crowded her. When she swept, he moved out of her path without a word. If he needed to enter the kitchen while she was there, he would pause at the threshold, his shadow falling across the floorboards, and wait until she had acknowledged him with a glance. It was a courtesy so profound, so alien to her past experiences, that it felt like a physical shield. He was a man of small, deliberate gestures. He began leaving a bucket of fresh water for her just inside the door each morning, saving her the first trip to the well. When she served him tea, he would wait, watching her pour her own, and then gently slide the warmer of the 2 cups toward her across the table. He never spoke of these things. They were simply done. One afternoon, she found him at the table, struggling with the script in a letter from the land office. He could read, but the formal, looping letters gave him trouble. The S looks like an F, he said, his voice tight with a frustration he rarely showed. She moved to stand beside him, not behind, maintaining a respectful distance. May I? She asked, her finger hovering over the page. He nodded, a short, sharp gesture. She pointed to the word. That is disbursement. It means payment. She explained the other difficult words, her voice low and even. He listened, his focus absolute. When she was done, he looked not at the paper, but at her. You have a good education. My mother was a teacher, she said softly, the first piece of her past she had offered. He simply nodded again. A useful skill. He did not press for more. He accepted the gift of her knowledge as quietly as he accepted the mended shirts and the warm meals, and in his acceptance she felt a sliver of trust take root in the barren soil of her heart. He was a safe harbor. A quiet one, but safe. The knock on the door was an unwelcome intrusion, sharp and demanding. Silas opened it to find Mr. Finch standing on his porch, a man whose wealth was announced by the shine on his boots and the smug certainty of his smile. Finch owned the neighboring ranch, a vast operation that was slowly swallowing smaller homesteads. Blackwood, Finch said, his eyes sliding past Silas to peer into the house. Heard you had some help. A man in your position, it's good to have a woman's touch about the place. Silas didn't move, his body a solid obstacle in the doorway. I have a housekeeper, so I see. Finch's gaze landed on Elara, who had stilled in the kitchen, her back to the door. He saw the scar. A cruel smile flickered on his lips. Damaged goods, though, ain't she? Suppose a man like you can't be too particular. The air went cold. Silas felt a slow, dangerous anger uncoil in his chest. He took a single step forward, out onto the porch, effectively shielding Elara from Finch's view. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. You will show respect to those in my home, Finch, or you will not be welcome on my land. Finch's smile faltered. He was a man used to deference, to getting his way through casual cruelty and the power of his name. He hadn't expected this stony, absolute defense from the solitary rancher. No offense intended, he said, raising his hands in mock surrender, though his eyes were hard. Just making an observation. Then keep your observations to yourself, Silas said, his gaze unwavering. State your business or leave. Finch, flustered and angered by the rebuke, mumbled something about a stray steer and made a hasty departure. Silas stood on the porch for a long moment, watching the man ride away, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. When he turned back, Elara was standing just inside the door. She would not meet his eyes, but he saw the faint tremor in her hands and the protective way she had angled her face away. He had seen fear in her before, but now, mixed with it, was something else. A fragile, hesitant flicker of gratitude that felt heavier and more important than any threat Finch could ever pose. The sky had been a bruised purple all afternoon, the air thick and heavy with unspoken promises. When the storm finally broke, it was with a terrifying violence. Rain came down in solid, deafening sheets, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf around the corners of the small house. Silas, sleeping in the barn, was woken by the sound of a loud crack, followed by the groan of stressed timber. He pulled on his boots and ran for the house, fearing the roof had given way. He found Elara in the main room, frantically moving furniture away from the center of the ceiling where a steady stream of water now poured onto the floorboards. The leak was directly over the spot where he sometimes laid his bedroll. The big oak branch, she said over the roar of the storm. It must have fallen on the roof. Together, they worked, using every pot and bucket they had to catch the deluge. The floor was soaked, the air cold and damp. The storm raged for hours, trapping them in the small, lamplit space. When its fury finally began to recede to a sullen rumble, an exhausted quiet fell over the room. The barn would be flooded. His bedroll was soaked. There was nowhere dry for him to sleep. Elara stood by the door to her room, her arms wrapped around herself. The floor in there, protected by the stronger part of the roof, was dry. She hesitated, her pride warring with a practical compassion he was coming to recognize. Mr. Blackwood, she began, her voice barely a whisper, the floor is dry in here. It was an invitation, offered into the tense, dripping silence. A profound shift in the geography of their arrangement. He looked from her face, shadowed and uncertain, to the open door of his own bedroom. Sharing a room, even with him on the floor, was a boundary they had never approached. "Elara," he said, using her first name for the first time. The sound of it hung in the air between them. "Are you certain?" He would not accept if there was a shred of doubt. The choice had to be hers, and hers alone. She met his gaze, and for the first time, she did not try to hide her face. Her eyes were clear and resolute. "Yes," she said, "I am." He gave a slow, deliberate nod, accepting the trust she offered. He retrieved his dry spare blanket and laid it on the floor, a respectful distance from the bed, his back to the door. In the damp, gray light of morning, the house felt different. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and a new, fragile intimacy that lingered in the air between them. They moved around each other with a heightened awareness, the memory of their shared proximity in the small room, a silent current running beneath the surface of their chores. The leak was repaired, the oak branch cleared, but the boundary, once crossed, could not be entirely rebuilt. He took to sleeping on the floor of the main room, near the hearth, arguing that it was warmer now that autumn was setting in. Neither of them acknowledged the real reason. The barn now seemed too far away. News of Finch's visit, and Silas's defense of his housekeeper, had curdled into gossip in town. The whispers followed Elara when she went for supplies, pitying glances and cruel speculation that made her pull the shield of her bonnet ever closer. Finch, his pride wounded, fanned the flames. He made it known that he considered the scarred woman little more than property, a stray to be claimed. One evening, Silas found Elara by the kitchen window, staring out at the darkening fields. The lamplight traced the silver line on her cheek, and he saw her hand lift, her fingers hovering over the mark as if to wipe it away. He stopped, his usual silence feeling inadequate. He walked to the stove and poured 2 cups of tea, setting the warmer one beside her. "Does it pain you?" he asked, his voice low. The question was simple, direct. Not about its origin, not about her past, but about her present. A question of care. She flinched, then slowly shook her head. "Only when I remember." The words were barely audible. He leaned a hand against the wall, not crowding her, but creating a small, solid space around them. "Then we will make new memories here," he said. It was not a promise of forgetting, but of building something new over the old foundations. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and he saw the deep, aching vulnerability she kept so carefully hidden. It was a look that asked for nothing, but offered a glimpse into a world of hurt he was beginning to understand. She did not speak of it again for many days. Then, one night, as they sat at the table in the companionable quiet that had become their habit, she rested her mending in her lap and finally broke the silence. "He was a man like Mr. Finch," she said, her voice soft but steady. "My father owed him a debt." Silas stopped his work, which was oiling the leather of his saddlebags, and gave her his full attention. He did not speak, did not prompt. He simply listened, his stillness an invitation for her to continue if she chose. "The debt was to be paid with my hand in marriage. I refused." She traced an invisible pattern on the worn fabric in her lap. He did not like to be told no. He said if he could not have my pretty face, he would make sure no one else wanted it either. The plain, brutal honesty of it landed in the quiet room like a stone. He saw it all in a flash, the terror, the pain, the injustice. It was the story of a predator, the kind of man he despised, one who saw people as objects to be owned or broken. He felt that same cold anger from the day on the porch rise in him again, but he banked it down. What she needed now was not his rage, but his strength. He looked at her, at the proud, straight line of her back, at the courage it took to speak those words aloud. She had survived. She was a survivor. He reached across the small table, not to touch her, but to push the lantern a little closer, its warm glow softening the shadows in the room. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, unbreakable vow. "No one will lay a hand on you here," he said, the words as solid and real as the timber of the house. "Not while I draw breath." She finally lifted her eyes to his. The fear was still there, a ghost in their depths, but for the first time he saw something else alongside it, the faintest glimmer of hope. She had shared the source of her pain, and he had met it not with pity, but with a shield. The confrontation, when it came, was not with fists, but with paper. Mr. Finch arrived one morning not alone, but with the town's reedy constable in tow. Finch held a document in his hand, a smug, proprietary look on his face. Silas met them on the porch, positioning himself squarely in the doorway. Elara stood behind him, in the shadows of the main room, her heart a cold, hammering drum against her ribs. "Blackwood," Finch began, his voice oozing false authority. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding. This woman," he gestured dismissively toward the house, "is not your housekeeper. She is an indentured servant. Her father's debt was sold to me. She belongs in my household." He thrust the paper forward. It was a forgery, and a clumsy one at that, but it bore an official-looking stamp. The constable shifted his feet, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to cross a man as powerful as Finch. "This is my land," Silas said, his voice flat and hard as granite, "and she is under my protection. She is not for sale." "It's not a sale. It's a legal transfer of contract," Finch sneered. "She has no say in the matter. Now step aside, or I'll have the constable remove you for obstruction." He took a step forward, his intent clear. He meant to enter the house, to take her. Silas did not move. He was a wall. He would fight if he had to. He would tear the man apart with his bare hands before he let him lay a finger on her. But before he could act, a voice, clear and strong, came from behind him. "I am not a contract." Elara stepped out of the shadows and into the light, coming to stand beside Silas. She did not shrink. She did not hide her face. She looked directly at Finch, her eyes blazing with a fire Silas had never seen before. The constable looked startled. Finch's smug expression faltered. They had expected a frightened, broken thing, not this woman of quiet steel. "I am a free woman," Elara continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. She took another step, closing the small distance between herself and Silas, their shoulders almost touching. It was a declaration, a claiming of space and of partnership. "I am not property to be bought or sold. My father's debts died with him," Finch sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "The paper says—" "The paper is a lie," she cut him off, her gaze unwavering. "And you are a liar." She then turned her eyes, not to the constable, but to Silas. It was a look that conveyed everything, trust, fear, and a question. He met her gaze, and in that silent, split-second exchange, an entire conversation passed between them. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod. "I am with you. I will back your play." It was all she needed. She turned back to the two men on the porch. "I choose to be here. This is my home." Her voice did not tremble. "I stay here, with him." The final two words were spoken with a quiet, unshakable finality. It was her choice, her agency, that delivered the final blow. Finch could argue with Silas's fists, but he could not argue with the undeniable truth of a woman standing her ground and claiming her own life. The constable, seeing the absolute certainty in her eyes and the granite-like support of the man beside her, made his decision. "Mr. Finch," he said, clearing his throat, "the lady has made her position clear. There's nothing more to be done here." Finch stared, his mouth agape, defeated not by violence, but by a bond he could not comprehend. He crumpled the paper in his fist, threw it to the ground, and stormed away without another word, the constable trailing awkwardly behind him. Silas and Elara remained on the porch, side by side, listening to the sound of the horses fade into the distance. The threat was gone. They had faced it together, and they had won. The silence that descended after Finch's departure was thick with unspoken emotion. The tension of the confrontation drained away, leaving them both trembling with the aftermath. Silas turned to look at Elara. Her back was still ramrod straight, but he saw the tremor in her hands. One of them clenched so tightly around the folds of her skirt that her knuckles were white. He saw a tiny bead of blood well up on her forefinger, where a sewing needle, forgotten in the fabric, had pricked her. Without a word, he gently took her hand. His touch was a question. She did not pull away. "May I?" he asked, his voice low and rough. She gave a small, jerky nod. He led her inside to the kitchen table and sat her down in one of the chairs. He went to the cupboard and retrieved a small tin of salve and a clean strip of cloth. Kneeling before her, he took her hand again, his large, calloused fingers infinitely gentle as he cleaned the small wound and smoothed the salve over it. He wrapped the cloth around her finger, his movements slow and deliberate. It was an act of profound care, a quiet tending to a wound far deeper than the pinprick on her skin. When he was finished, he did not immediately let go. He held her hand for a moment longer, his thumb stroking the back of it. She finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and with it, the tears came. They were not tears of fear, but of release, of a dam of unshed grief finally breaking. She brought her free hand up to her face, to her scar, as if in shame. "He makes me feel ... double quotes," she whispered, her voice choked. "Ugly." Silas's grip on her hand tightened, a steadying anchor. He rose, and with his other hand, he gently, carefully, pulled her hand away from her face. He looked at her, his gaze full of a raw, quiet reverence that stole her breath. He slowly, deliberately, removed his hat, a gesture of ultimate respect. "Elara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before, "you are not ugly. You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." In the days that followed, the house settled into a new kind of peace. The ghost of Finch's threat was gone, replaced by the solid certainty of their partnership. The routines remained the early mornings, the shared meals, the quiet evenings, but they were different now, imbued with an unspoken devotion. His protective scans of the horizon now included a glance back at the house, a check to see her moving in the window. Her careful domestic tasks were no longer just for her keep, but acts of creating a shared home. The lines of employer and housekeeper had long since blurred, replaced by something quieter, stronger, and more real. One evening, he sat on the porch step, carving a piece of scrap wood. She came to sit beside him, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the cooling air. She watched his hands, the way the knife moved with such precision and care, peeling away slivers of wood to reveal the shape within. He worked in silence for a long time, the only sound the soft scrape of the blade. When he was finished, he held it out to her on the palm of his hand. It was a small, intricately carved bird, its wings half spread as if about to take flight, a meadowlark. She heard them every morning, singing from the fence posts. He had carved her the sound of the morning. "It's for you," he said. She picked it up, its wooden form smooth and warm against her skin. It was not a ring, not a formal declaration. It was a token, a symbol, a promise spoken in his language of quiet, deliberate acts. She closed her fingers around it. "Thank you, Silas." It was the first time she had said his name with such simple, unadorned warmth. He looked at her, his face softened by the twilight, and a slow, rare smile touched his lips. "You are safe here, Elara?" he said. It was the vow he had made before, but now it meant something more. Not just safety from harm, but safety to be, to stay, to build. She smiled back, a true, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. "I know." Together, they looked out at the vast, darkening prairie, no longer two solitary islands, but the shared keepers of a small, warm light in the immense and beautiful darkness.